everyone, Sammy from Ketchapp. Glad to be back for this second edition of the Hyper Games conferences. We're here today to continue our series of presentations on the 3Cs in Hypercasual. Don't hesitate to catch up our previous presentation if you missed it. It was dedicated to controls and depth in Hypercasual, and it's available on the Hyper Games conferences YouTube channel. And today we'll focus on the two remaining Cs, camera and characters, and we'll see how they can best showcase your gameplay. And let's start with the camera. And yes, spoiler alert, as for the controls, there won't be good or bad camera by nature, and all that matters is that you pick the one that will better highlight the action of your game. Because with camera choice, you directly impact the understandability of your game, which is, as we know, key in hypercasual, as players have to figure out what's going on in your game in 3 seconds of video ads. Now, for the sake of simplicity of this presentation, we will regroup the main different types of cameras under 3 big categories. First, you'll have the superstar of camera in hypercasual, the third-person camera. We see it in around two-thirds of the games, and it's the perfect match for runners as it helps players to anticipate what's going to happen to them. Then you have the first-person camera, which remains historically quite marginal in hypercasual, but had quite a momentum in the last few months. And finally, you'll have the fixed camera that we find in almost all the light puzzles and simulation games. Now let's break down each of these big categories, starting with the biggest chunk, the third-person camera. And we will start with the most iconic one that we find in almost all the best runners out there. It is almost a no-brainer. This is probably the best camera to showcase your runners slash third-person action games for many reasons. First, because it allows players to see what's coming ahead and it let them better anticipate and react to the different enemies or obstacles they will face. Then it puts the character at the forefront of the action, which helps both with the precision of the controls and with the skin's creation, and thus the monetization. And finally, it's very adaptable as you can fine-tune the right level of zoom and angle to better fit your game's core specificities. Then, a bit less common, but great choice when your game is all about guiding your character in open area, the top-down view and its cousin, the isometric one. As you can see in OHM and Voodoo's Bullet Rush, this camera gives your character a very central position in a relatively open environment. It allows you to see what's coming in front of you, but also what's coming from the side and what's coming from behind you. But so yeah, basically it's perfect to be the companion of joystick-based games. But keep in mind that it also implies two important constraints. First, as your character will look smaller, you'll have to be especially careful about things like color contrasts or space occupation because you don't want your character to get lost around in its environment. Second, this type of camera usually makes it quite difficult to anticipate enemies or obstacles that would come from the sides of your screen. So do not hesitate to visually compensate these with UI elements like the classic light arrows showing incoming enemies who are still outside of the screen. And finally, if you want to try something more exotic, you can go for the front view angle. This camera mainly suits one very specific type of mechanic, which is the chasing one. As you can see in this video from Boulder Escape from NoHo, it is perfect to showcase enemies that would run after you in a very Crash Bandicoot style. But as you might have guessed, or as you might remember, the main downside of this approach is the lack of visibility on what's coming in front of your character. So if you want to dig this direction, make sure to make your game very forgiving with relatively slow movements, no instant death against obstacle, which anyway is almost a golden rule now in hypercasual these days. or UI elements, warnings to better anticipate what's coming, etc. Now let's move on to the first person camera. It has been a super hot topic in the hyper-casual world since the end of 2020, and even if it's true that we see more and more first-person hyper-casual games, it remains, at least purely in terms of downloads, quite marginal, as it represents less than 10% of the downloads in the top 100 hyper-casual games. Still, we have to recognize that this first-person approach brought some freshness to the market, and it really helps to renew specifically the aim game genre. The main advantage of first-person camera is that it really puts you as a player in the shoes of the character, and thus it really helps highlighting the power or the consequences of your actions. It works, for example, super well to highlight destruction scenes like in this groundbreaking video. However, this usually comes at a price. First, as your character remains almost invisible, it quite drastically reduces the skins and thus monetization opportunities in your game. Second, the lack of fully visible character might make a video of your game less easily understandable. And finally, since we are playing on a phone with only one hand, we can't control both characters and camera at the same time. So it means that you'll probably have to automate either the character's movements or the camera's movements. And finally, the most neutral camera of all, the fixed camera. This one is really straightforward, as basically its main point is to let the game speak for itself. And that's why we find it in light puzzles and simulation games, to let time for the players to either think or interact to find the solution or to admire the mesmerizing experience that the game might deliver. Finally, a quick word about the future of camera in hypercasual. If we take a step back, traditionally in hypercasual, a great core gameplay is what makes the success of your game. But as the competition increases, the execution tends to become gradually more important, and the attention and polish that we bring to the three C's also becomes more critical. And this is, of course, true for the camera. And that's why we expect to see more polished dynamic camera land in the coming month. Because beyond just keeping the game understandable, a good camera can and should sublimate your game. And that's something that remains, for now, quite marginal in hyper-casual games. Now, since hyper-casual games tomorrow will focus on things we tend to forget today, I'm pretty sure that we'll find plenty of games like Run and Gun from your game in the future. As you can see, this game is super smooth and super dynamic with amazing camera effects like zoom in, zoom out, tilts, follow-ups. It's really, and it brings a new level of immersion, and we are pretty sure that this is going to become more and more the trend in upcoming hyper-casual blockbusters. Now, and to finish this first part for today, remember that your camera is here to highlight what makes the core of the experience of your game, and it can actually have a quite dramatic impact on your in-game KPIs. For example, we had this underwater exploration game, and as you can see, we tried different creatives, some with first-person view, some other with third-person ones. And what we saw is that the third-person ones were performing way better. And if you think about it, it's not exactly surprising since third person better allows you to picture your character's evolution in its environment. It allows you to have a wider angle of vision. So if you're looking for treasures, it really helps. It also helps you better picturing the danger, like the shark here. So really, it kind of makes sense that third person was the better fit here. But still, that's something that you will have to keep in mind when you try creating your game when you pitch it. And now let's focus on our third and last C, the characters and how they evolved until now. And here again, as for camera, characters tend to be a bit forgotten. One proof of that is that in many games we don't even try to create our own characters and rather go with these famous little guys that I'm sure you've already seen at least once. And that's because we've put the importance of our core gameplay so high in our priority list that we tend to sometimes forget that finding the right character can actually make a big difference CPI wise. Of course, I'm not saying that this priority is wrong, the core gameplay is still what will make most of your CPI, but as execution tends to matter more and more, finding the right character might turn an already good game into an even greater one. And that's why iconic characters actually matter, because they can make a significant difference. They can help you lower your CPI of a few cents, which can be critical at some points because originality often pays in hypercasual, so fresh looking characters might better catch the eyes of the players than the asset store guys they've seen already in plenty of games. Second, they can help you build your own hypercasual native IPs like C Games and S2T did with Johnny Trigger, for example. This might help building a community of more faithful and engaged players, which could become even more useful in a post-IDFA era. And even broader, at your studio scale, it can be a great way to stand out and to build a unique brand image like One Button or Legendary did with their super recognizable 2D characters. Now, if we agree on the fact that characters actually matter, it's also important to take a step back and to see where they come from and what factor drive their evolution. Because as you can see, in 5 years, things changed quite drastically. From abstract 2D characters to 3D detailed and animated humanoids. And behind these changes, we can find mainly two factors. The first one is logical and almost quite obvious, but in 5 years, of course, technology drastically evolved, and our phones nowadays can run games that probably would have made our 2016 phones explode, if you think about it. Second one is more interesting and linked to the DNA of hypercasual. The hypercasual markets constantly needs to evolve to keep and renew the player's attention. So while preserving a visually relatively neutral approach, we had to make our basic characters evolve to something more eye-catching and relatable. But first, let's quickly get back to the very early days of hypercasual. At this time, 2D games with minimalism rules and characters are made of very simple, minimalistic shapes. This was both budget and dev time friendly, as well as a good way to keep things super simply understandable and to make any game run on any smartphone. But with phones gaining power and players getting tired of seeing the same 2D shapes over and over, 3D abstraction came as the new game changer. Not only it was refreshing visually, but it also opened new gameplay opportunities to play on perspective, physics, 3D movement. Minimalism remained the rule for a while for technical reasons, and also because it was super simple way to showcase, let's say, universally understandable concepts, because wherever you are in the world, a ball rolls and falls in the same way. But all big hyper-casual trends fade away one day, and players started to get bored of these minimalistic 3D games. And that's how we entered the last and richest chapter of hyper-casual characters with the humanoids era. It allowed hyper-casual games to tell more interesting short stories and to use these stories to catch players' attention, with, for example, very classic themes as cops versus robbers. So overall, it brought a wind of freshness on hypercasual and opened plenty of new opportunities. It also opened new doors for characters customization and for more appealing skins that helped with monetization. And finally, this trend also had its own sub-trends. We've seen the neutral stickmen in all colors and shapes, the detailed cartoony characters, now the realistic ones, the destroyable ones, the evolving ones, they are just endless possibilities. And that leads us to the characters we see now. What are the current trends, character-wise, in hypercasual, and where is the market going? Well, let's try to sum up everything. And first, one thing is very clear, hypercasual characters are becoming more expressive. I mean, take a look at these guys' faces. Clearly, they evolved to adapt to this emoji React era. And this is great because it totally helps bringing some humor to your game, which is always a nice way to catch players' attention. And beyond facial animations, Buddy's animations are also getting richer, more diverse, from the classic funny dancing moves to contextual animations and movements like auto taking cover when moving next to a wall. We're seeing more advanced characters whose actions convey more emotions, more juiciness, and we expect this to be a long-lasting trend. Speaking of long-lasting trend, body stacking evolution has been super hot over the past month. This mechanic is actually nothing more than the evolution of the stacking trend, but made more relatable. You collect things and see your character's body morph as it moves forward. Thing is that this trend has been around for months now, and we've seen so many different themes around this mechanic that it's probably going to be quite hard to find new ones to interest the players. So I personally think that this trend of body stacking core gameplay as we know it right now might soon be over. But I also think that this trend could leave a quite strong legacy behind it. What it brought as added juiciness, as clever diegetic way to understand the health of your character, but also what it brought as forgiveness mechanic. For example, in Wacky Run, where instead of dying, your characters are just slowed down in a very visually satisfying way. I think that all this might be here to stay, or that at least we could find it in, or the influence of it in many future releases. And now we have what's probably the hottest trend of the moment, the hypersexualization of hypercasual characters. What's interesting is that it mainly started as clickbait strategy to make more powerful creatives. And as the industry realized the power of these creatives, we started to see these hyper-sexualized characters invading games, and we sometimes directly linked sexualized core gameplays. So the question is now, should you follow the trend or should you remain far from it? Should you put sexy characters and allusions in all of your future games to help you decrease their CPI? Well, it's a tricky question. Yes, on one side, sex sells. It always did. And if we take the ethical question apart, it is business-wise probably a very effective way to attract your users' attention. But we also need to take into consideration the industry we evolve in, an industry where we are highly dependent of our distribution and communication channels. Of course, I'm speaking here about the App Store, Google Play, but also of all the ad networks that we are using to acquire users. And the thing is that these platforms have clear rules against sexualized content. And that can put a lot of randomness in your game's potential success. You might have a super efficient creative, but what will happen to your scaling if a few angry users start reporting it? Your ad might get rejected, your campaign's performances would be harmed, and if your core concept is in its DNA a bit explicit, well, you might just have to move on to your next game. So you want to be careful on this trend. Another interesting thing that came up with the numerous attempts of going first person is the way characters are now represented in first person view games. First, it can be via grounded body, like in Zombie Royale, where you can feel the weight of your body as your whole character moves forwards. You've got health, enemies that can interact with you and slow you down. It's a really a great way to make us feel the thrill of the situation as if we were living it, basically. Then, on the opposite, the invisible body, where only the tool matters. Whether it's a dentist weapon or a gun, the idea is that our character doesn't really matter and has to fade away behind the tool that is performing the action and which is here to mainly explain the situation. This is perfect to highlight mesmerizing action and mostly used in simulation game. And in between, you have the middle ground with the floating body, like in Force Master from Voodoo, for example, where the action matters the most, but it makes things more easily understandable to have these ends floating. And if we go even further, there are also cases where the character doesn't even need to appear, just because this is not the point of the game. This is especially the case in lat puzzles and simulation games where bringing a visible character would only parasite the good understanding of the game. On the contrary, the absence of character gives to the player space to fully enjoy the show, whether it's a mesmerizing to watch action or a puzzle that requires light reflection. And to finish this presentation, we mentioned it already, but with a character's choice comes a short story. And the impact of this short story can be huge on your game's attractiveness. We have a quite interesting example on this topic. Here on the left is the ancestor of our game, Master Thief. But as you can see, the setting and characters were quite different. Here, you play a guy in underwear running on a rooftop away from zombie waves. And as you can see, this isn't exactly the definition of promising game as it got a $1 CPI. But then we changed the character to tell another story. What happens if we're now a thief trying to steal some pieces of art to cops in a museum? Well, the results are far more interesting. This example is, I think, a perfect illustration of the strength of the short story your characters is telling in your game. So don't underestimate the power of your characters and of the themes of your game, as they can play a big role and they might make the difference when it comes to launching your game or not. And that's it for today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. Again, don't hesitate to take a look at our previous HGC video about controls and depth, or to contact me on Pine or LinkedIn, and I'll be back in a few seconds to answer all your questions. See you!